I will.
Yeah, good.
In your home.
Yeah. Once a month. I also want to thank the Southside Democrats, Carl Schilling's their president. They're real active. They're a great group. Appreciate you co-hosting. Polk County Dems, it's good to have you on the team. I do want to note that there are folks who came from as far as Omaha and Lincoln, Nebraska.
Wow.
We're still not going to let them caucus. It's the wrong side of the Missouri River, but we're appreciative for those friends who came. Like a lot of you, I think I probably became familiar with Beto O'Rourke during his 2018 Senate campaign, which was inspiring, I think, to not only the 4 million Texans who voted for him, and not only because of who he was running against, but it really seemed like it was a politician who exuded authenticity and was kind of surprisingly transparent and spoke the truth. And after a few years of having who we have in the White House, a pathological liar who I'm not going to say because what I'm thinking because cameras are here, but we need truth, right? And he's been speaking truth. His voice is an important one in this race, and I think the hope of his campaign that I've seen, and hopefully we'll get to explore it more today, is that it shifts the political paradigm that we've been operating under for a long time toward really a new generation of progressive leadership. So I feel really fortunate to have him in our House, and fortunate to have him on the campaign, running for president. The former congressman from Texas, Beto O'Rourke.
All right.
Thank you, Nathan, Andrea. Thank you for opening up your home and having Judah and Oscar and Campbell greet us as we came in. We thought Oscar was going to make some opening remarks, but maybe he'll make the closing remarks at today's event. Was also greeted by Representative Brian Meyer, who I am very grateful for, a fellow Replacements fan. We were trading some notes on that. Maybe Troy Price is in the house?
Back here, yes.
Hello.
Hey, thank you for being here. Appreciate that. State Chair Troy Price, and each of you for taking some time out of your Saturday to welcome us. This is our 5th house party today so far. It'll be the best house party so far. And we're grateful to each of you for welcoming us and for taking your democracy and your role in our democracy of deciding who the nominee will be for the Democratic Party so seriously. And I love the way that Nathan introduced me. Regardless of whether you are a supporter or you support somebody else or you're curious, or this will just be the first of many conversations that we have as you perform your due diligence, not just for your vote or your night at the caucus, but for, by extension, the rest of the country. I'm glad and grateful for what you do. And in gratitude for that, I'm going to make sure that I try to bring as many voices into this conversation, do my best to answer your questions, to listen to what's on your mind, and the solutions that you propose to some of the challenges that confront us right now. It is in town hall meetings like these that I held as a member of City Council every single week for the 6 years that I served my community, that I learned so much from those whom I represented. I also got to hear their complaints. If your neighbor's dog was barking too loud the night before, you brought that to the town hall meeting. If your garbage had not been picked up, I heard about that as well. But I also heard your ideas for economic development, keeping young people in our community or attracting them back to El Paso. We were able to act on some of the best of those ideas. As a member of Congress, every single year in the minority, the only way to get something done was to be able to work with my colleagues who were across the aisle, didn't come to the same conclusions on the same issues that I did, but were every bit as American and just as important in being able to advance our priorities. And out of town halls like these, I learned about opportunities to expand mental health care access for veterans in a country that is losing too many veterans who came back from Vietnam to a country that did not understand or appreciate their service and sacrifice, who are coming back right now from Afghanistan, a war that is in its 18th year, from Iraq, where we had been through 6 successive presidential administrations. It was veterans and their family members who guided me and sent me my order so when I went back to Washington, D.C., I found those Republican colleagues with whom I could work to expand mental health care access for veterans, ensure that we had better outcomes, and that we saved more lives. At one of those town halls in El Paso, I heard about Kastner Range. 7,000 acres of Chihuahuan desert wilderness in our community of El Paso, in the Franklin Mountains at a base elevation of about 4,000 feet. It's stunning, it's gorgeous, it's owned by the Department of the Army, and is about to be sold potentially for development, and we're going to lose it forever. The other distinguishing characteristic of Kastner Range is that it has the recorded human history of my hometown going back 10,000 years. The first El Pasoans, though they didn't call our community El Paso, left their impressions of the physical and metaphysical world as they encountered it on the sides of the caves and the rocks there. Their story is part of our story as Americans, and people at town hall meetings like these said we need to protect Kastner Range as a national monument. So we preserve it from development and are able to share this story with the rest of America. I worked as hard as I knew how with the Obama administration to try to get a national monument declaration. We hosted massive meetings in El Paso. We had, it seemed like every school child in our public school system write a letter to the president. We did our part, and yet we came up a little bit short. After President Obama was succeeded by President Trump, we persisted, and I used my position on the House Armed Services Committee, though I was in the minority, to include a provision in the National Defense Bill that would protect all 7,000 of those acres in perpetuity. I worked with my Republican chairman, with my Republican colleagues. We got it passed in the House, and we got it included in the Senate version of that same defense bill, signed into law by a president who is diminishing the size of our protected public lands right now. And I'm grateful that he did it, even if he didn't know what he was signing at the moment. He helped us to achieve one of our priorities. And it showed me that if you're willing to work with anyone, anytime, anywhere, you can advance the agenda of this community, of this state, of our country. It's the way that I served in Congress, in the city council. It's the way that I campaigned across the state of Texas. All 254 counties. No me importa how small, how big, how Republican, how Democratic. We didn't take you for granted, and we didn't write you off. We listened, we learned from that Republican county that voted for Donald Trump 95 or 96% in the last election. I now know what is important to them, what their priorities are, better capable now to serve those whom I want to represent. Same way across Iowa. In the biggest of cities, in the smallest of towns, everyone is important to us. Everyone counts. We listen to and learn from those whom we hope to serve. We learn about the need for disaster relief along the banks of the Missouri River at a time that we've seen 4 times the runoff of an average year in that Missouri River basin, the greatest level of runoff that we have seen for as long as we've been keeping records about the Missouri River. Those farmers need disaster relief right now, and they need it also for the stored grain that is spoiling as long as we are in trade wars and have tariffs that make what we grow in this state uncompetitive around the rest of the world. They also need infrastructure and investment by the Army Corps of Engineers to mitigate the floods that we will have going forward, because we will have them going forward. The scientists say beyond the shadow of a doubt that the floods that we see today here in your state, in Nebraska, in my home state, where 58 inches of rain fell from the sky on Houston, Texas, the landfall record for as long as we've been keeping them in North America. And that those rains, those floods, those fires, those droughts through which our farmers persist will become more frequent, more devastating, more profound, undermine our ability to grow our own food and fiber that feeds and clothes not just this country, but so much of the rest of the world, will consume more of our property and our lives, and ensure that the generations that follow will have a diminished chance of success, and in some cases, even survival. So beyond the disaster relief, which is imperative and we must act on now, beyond the infrastructure funding to mitigate future disasters, we've got to make sure that all of us come together, Republicans and Democrats, rural and urban alike, regardless of whom we pray to, who we love, where we are from, to do what we can with the 10 years left to us to prevent this planet from warming another degree Celsius. That means following your lead here in Iowa. You, more than any other state, generate more of your power from wind. Texas generates more in terms of absolute capacity. We're also taking the lead on solar, where El Paso, Texas is now building out utility-scale solar in one of the sunniest places on the planet today, freeing ourselves from a dependence on fossil fuels and an economy that runs on greenhouse gas emissions. Investing in renewable energy, solar and wind not only are essential to the next generation, they provide this generation with high wage, high skill, high value jobs. The two fastest growing jobs in the United States today are wind and they're solar. And if we can do our part everywhere in America, including and maybe especially in rural communities, where farmers tell me they want to do their part by being incentivized in the Farm Bill to plant cover crops, to use precision tilling and farming to disturb less of the carbon under the ground and to capture more of it out of the air. If they can have more of their land, not under cultivation, but left wild, incentivized through the conservation program in the Farm Bill that has been diminished in every iteration of the Farm Bill, we will partner with rural America. In other words, rural America can do its part just like every other part of this country. And so I want to make sure that especially for those little people here in the room and the generations that will follow us, the people of the future, that we have done everything that we possibly could while we still had the chance to act, and that we were not found wanting at this defining, decisive moment of truth. Whether it's for the existential challenge of climate, or the fact that in the wealthiest, the most powerful country on the face of the planet, we have millions of our fellow Americans who cannot see a doctor, who cannot afford their prescription, some who are dying of diabetes or the flu or curable cancers, despite the fact that we're in the year 2019. Universal, guaranteed, high-quality health care for every single American so that they are well enough to live to their full potential and to fulfill their promise is a goal for all of us. No matter who you are and where you live. But it's going to take all of us to achieve it. Or this goal, knowing full well that more than 1 million of our fellow Americans who were born somewhere else, brought to this country at a young age, live in constant fear of deportation to a place whose language they do not speak, where they no longer have family, where if they are successful against those long odds, they'll be successful for that place and that country, not this place and our country. Being able to free them from that fear forever by making them U.S. citizens in this, their true home country, and not doing it at the price of a 30-foot high, 2,000-mile long, $30 billion wall that we do not need, that will, by the way, require you to take people's farms and ranches and homes, because it will not be built in the center line of the Rio Grande River channel. It'll be built well within the United States. And what will it keep out? Children who traveled 2,000 miles, fleeing desperation, crushing poverty, and horrific violence in the most brutal, the deadliest places on the planet today. Kids who, if they are lucky, arrive with their moms, who far too often have been separated from those parents, placed into cages, to have that mother who risked her very life sent back from the very country from which she fled. If we want to live our values and our morals and even just follow the laws that are on the books, not only must we welcome those who have no other place to go, not separate them, reunify those who have been separated, we must also rewrite this country's immigration laws in our own image. Our own image here in Des Moines, our own image in El Paso, because both communities are comprised of refugees and immigrants and asylum seekers, or the descendants of refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants. That is the very foundation and source of our strength, our success, and yes, though this flies in the face of the president's rhetoric, our safety and our security. And I know that we can do it. And I know that it's this country that will come together to do it. But if we are going to be successful when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to climate, when it comes to immigration, when it comes to partnering with rural America, we're going to have a democracy that actually works. And today we have one that has been captured and corrupted by corporations and special interests at a time of unprecedented concentration of wealth and power and privilege. A Supreme Court that literally in 2010 decided that corporations are people and money is speech, and therefore corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money to purchase the outcomes of legislation and election. It has invited the cynicism, the disenchantment, and the disengagement of millions of our fellow Americans, compounded by the fact that in too many parts of this country we have locked people out of their democracy. Texas ranked 50th in the country in voter turnout, not because we like our democracy any less than you do here in Iowa, but because we were drawn that way by the state legislature. Some people, based on their race, their ethnicity, their country of national origin, were literally drawn out of a congressional district. Their vote diminished, and so they did not vote, drawn out of a reason to vote, and drawn out of their democracy. I want to make sure that we have a new Voting Rights Act that ensures that one person, one vote in every single state in this county. I want same day and automatic voter registration when you turn 18 in this country. I want to end gerrymandering where members of Congress choose their own voters and get big money out of our politics. No PACs, no special interests, no corporations, just human beings. Just our fellow Americans. But during the last great progressive moment that followed the last great concentration of wealth and power and privilege in the Gilded Age, Theodore Roosevelt said, "Any hope of achieving true political democracy is contingent on a vigorous pursuit of economic democracy. When kids, when men, when women in this country do not see a future for themselves in this country, then this country has no future as a democracy." We have to break up this concentration of wealth and power and privilege. We have to reverse some of the worst excesses that we've seen in this administration and in previous administrations. Those people of the future, your kids, when they're reading their history books in high school and in college, will not believe that at a time of $21 trillion in debt, with $4 trillion of unmet infrastructure needs, with rural America not having access to broadband internet reliably, with millions unable to see a doctor, our solution was to cut a $2 trillion tax cut that flowed to corporations and the very wealthiest in this country at a time of historic divisions in wealth and income. Instead, we need to make investments in people. Everyone who's working should be able to work one job and that's it. It should be enough. School teachers working 2 and 3 jobs makes no sense when they have the most important job in front of them. That child whose lifelong love of learning, once unlocked, will make them unbeatable, will make this country unstoppable. We need to strengthen, not diminish, the power of unions so more Americans can enter apprenticeships to learn a skill or a trade that allows them to live with dignity and function and purpose in their lives and command a real paycheck. Parents need to be able to take paid family leave to take care of their kids, their parents, or themselves without compromising their job or their income. And women need to be paid what men are paid for performing the same work in the same job and providing the same value. These are some of the ways that we can meet these historic challenges, but we are going to have to do it together. The differences cannot divide us. We cannot be defined by our fears of ourselves or one another or those from outside this country. Instead, we must be known forever after by our ambitions, our aspirations, the work, the resolve, the creativity, the service, and yes, the sacrifice that we are willing to bring to bear in order to achieve them. That's why I'm running, and that's the way in which I'm running, to serve you as President of the United States of America. And I'm grateful that you've had me out here today, and I'm looking forward to your questions, your comments, and your suggestions. Thank you all very, very much. Nathan and Andrea, thank you for having us out. Cynthia's got a microphone. If you've got a question, she will bring it to you, and we'll do our best to respond.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
I think you mentioned earlier that you've been listening to Trump voters, and I assume that they're Trump voters who are looking for an alternative. Could you share with us what you're hearing? What do they want?
I hear people all over the country who voted for Hillary Clinton, who voted for Donald Trump, who stayed home and did not vote at all, who wonder if this democracy still works. if it's worth their time to vote, if anybody responds, if anyone is listening to them, when they know that our institutions are captured by those who can pay for access. And I can give you some examples. In 2017, the Congress of the United States of America passed legislation that allows internet service providers to sell your private browsing history without your consent. So if you think of the weirdest places that you've been on the World Wide Web, and now you know that that is sold to the highest bidder, it flies in the face of consumer interest, of the interests of those members of Congress constituents. But if you follow the money from those internet service providers, the PAC checks that they cut, you begin to understand how we get this result. Why are our pharmaceutical medications so expensive in this country? Our first day on the campaign trail in Keokuk, which is one of these communities that voted for Barack Obama in 2008, voted for Donald Trump in 2016. One of the first questions is from a woman who says that her daughter, who has health insurance, pays $444 per prescription refill, and that's after the co-pays kick in. This country buys so many drugs through the VA, through the Department of Defense, through the federal government for federal employees who are insured, through Medicaid, through Medicare, and yet we do not use our bargaining power, our leverage, the amount that we purchase to drive down those costs. Y además, in addition, we do not allow you to purchase drugs from Canada or Mexico or the European Union if you can get them for less money. Why? It's otherwise inexplicable until you look at the PAC checks that are cut from the pharmaceutical companies. Why do we have the largest prison population on the face of the planet? Disproportionately comprised of people of color. Too many there for nonviolent drug crimes, including possession of marijuana, a substance that is legal or decriminalized in most states in this country. Why is that happening? While Purdue Pharma, who sold opioids to prescribers as being non-addictive, a miracle drug, and 70,000 Americans overdosed on drugs and died last year, and not one executive from that company, not one shareholder, has paid any meaningful price or spent a night in jail, though they are connected to the deaths and sufferings of so many of our fellow Americans. It is because power purchases more power right now, and the safeguards of our democracy, implemented 243 years ago, are not working. When members of Congress are choosing their voters, when the Supreme Court says that corporations are people, when these PACs are buying the outcomes of legislation before them, then we rightfully are frustrated and can express that frustration at the ballot box or express it by not showing up at the ballot box in the first place. So this campaign that accepts not a dime from a single PAC, corporate or otherwise, no help from lobbyists, no support for corporation, and goes everywhere. In fact, started in Keokuk, as a matter of fact, to listen to everyone. And we say, we do not care who you voted for last time. It's even unimportant who you're going to vote for next time. It doesn't even matter to me if you can vote at all because of your status or because of a prior conviction. You are my fellow American, and before we were anything else, we are human beings and Americans first. And we have this opportunity to come together now at this historic moment. I'm convinced that if we listen to one another, if we learn from what we hear, and then if we deliver to these communities. I went to Lordstown, Ohio, a community that candidate Donald Trump said would thrive under his leadership. That GM plant has just effectively closed down. Thousands of jobs are now gone. GM that we helped to bail out. GM, a beneficiary of that $2 trillion tax break. GM, who the people of Ohio invested $82 million in. And the president's response? He lights up David Green, the president of UAW 1112. This guy who's working his tail off for the people who live in that community and the members of his union. We were there the day after the president did this to listen to David Green, to be in his community, to find out what we could do to help him. So whether it's winning an election or bringing this country together after the election, we've got to be there for everyone, respect everyone, and serve everyone. Thank you for the question. Appreciate it.
We're upstairs. Hi.
Hey.
We all know that healthcare is just critically important in this election, and women's health and reproductive health is a huge part of that, and people being able to determine their own lives and really be healthy. As you know, Texas has experienced just devastating reproductive health outcomes with the closure of all of the clinics. Iowa sadly has experienced very similar things. We were defunded by the state legislature, had one of the most restrictive abortion bans in the country. And sadly now the Trump-Pence administration is going after reproductive health care through the Title X Act. What opportunities do you see for the president to really be a leader in making sure that healthcare, women's health, reproductive health is accessible and available for everyone who needs it?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. And I think your willingness to ask questions like these of those who want to hold positions of public trust like me is what gets this on the agenda and ensures that we have action and make progress. As you said, in Texas, our state legislature and our governors have closed down more than a quarter of our family planning clinics. And not only does that restrict the right to an abortion, as important as that is, it also means that getting a cervical cancer screening becomes near impossible for so many women who don't have access to one of those clinics. Getting family planning help, non-existent. Seeing a provider of any kind in a state that refused to expand Medicaid just makes life that much harder. And yes, it's connected to a crisis in maternal mortality in Texas that is 3 times as deadly for women of color. So when I talk about this in Texas, in the most conservative place and the most liberal place, when I talk about it here in this home in Des Moines, I talk about it as a matter of healthcare. We're going to lose more women in our lives. We're going to lose more women in this country unless we ensure that universal, guaranteed, high-quality healthcare means every woman makes her own decisions about her own body and has access to the providers, to the doctors, and the healthcare that allows her to do that. In Texas, at the same time that we were closing down all these clinics, we saw a spike in teen pregnancies, and in fact, we lead the country now in the rate of repeat teen pregnancy. So this maternal mortality crisis, this rate of repeat teen pregnancy, these cannot be the intended results that our state legislature, Republican or Democrat, pro-life or pro-choice, intended. Perhaps there we have the common ground in order to have the conversation necessary to do better for all of us. And that's the way that I'll continue to speak about this. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
By the front door.
Please go.
Thank you, Congressman, for being here. Would you chat a little bit about what your foreign policy would be, particularly concerning the Soviet Union and NATO? Thank you.
The alliances that we have enjoyed, especially those over the last 75 years, were forged in sacrifice, in service from service members here in this country. And the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, those 29 members, including the United States, are there for one another's common defense and have in part prevented another world war since World War II. And in fact, the only time the clause calling for common defense, Article 5 of the NATO Charter, has been invoked was when the United States of America was attacked in 9/11. Those other countries have had our back, and we should have theirs. Our president invites speculation about whether we will remain a member of NATO, whether it is worthwhile, which also invites provocation from Russia. This is the same president who has befriended dictators and strongmen all over the world, from Erdogan in Turkey to al-Sisi in Egypt to Vladimir Putin on that stage in Helsinki, Finland, saying he believes that guy, who our intelligence community say beyond the shadow of a doubt sought to undermine our democracy and perhaps almost did, versus our own intelligence community. He has told us that he's fallen in love with Kim Jong-un, the murderous dictator in North Korea who possesses the means to attack other countries in the Asia-Pacific region with nuclear weapons, perhaps has the means to attack this country with nuclear weapons, has the blood of Otto Warmbier on his hands. This is the guy he's fallen in love with. At the same time that he turns his back on our traditional allies, whether they are NATO or our trading partners in Mexico and Canada, the destination for so much of what we grow and produce and make in this country, including here in Iowa. So I would strengthen, not weaken, those alliances, renew those friendships, put some distance between us and those dictators, including those in Saudi Arabia who have the blood of journalists on their hands, who are bombing the life out of their neighboring country in Yemen with impunity, bringing 7 million to the brink of starvation right now. This is who our president today is friends with. I'd also do more to make sure that we convene the countries of this world around otherwise intractable problems. Climate change, even if the United States stopped emitting another ounce of greenhouse gases today, it would not be enough for the world. China has 3 to 4 times the number of coal-fired plants going right now. As India and Africa continue to come online, we're going to have our work cut out for us. So we need to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. We're the one party that has exited it out of the 194 countries on the planet. We need to bring other countries together around this, around nuclear disarmament, about ending these wars that have lasted for decades in some cases that we are currently engaged in. And then one final opportunity that I want to bring our attention to. We have long neglected those countries to whom we are connected by land, by history, by culture, and increasingly in this country, by language. We've intervened to overthrow their governments, to participate in their civil wars, but have not played a constructive role in the Western Hemisphere. This is our chance. Literally tens of thousands of kids, sometimes with their parents, are showing up at our front door asking for help, leaving what are in some cases the deadliest places on the planet today, the Northern Triangle of Central America. This is your president's response. He wants to zero out the $500 million in aid that we are providing to those 3 countries. To put that $500 million in context, $500 million, he wants to spend $30 billion on a wall to keep these kids and their moms out. So for a fraction of the cost, what if we doubled, not just $500 million, but $1 billion to those countries, spend it on violence reduction in those communities? Those who studied it have said there's a correlation. When violence comes down in their hometowns, they stop leaving their hometowns, because no human in their right mind would take their little 6-month-old baby and walk 2,000 miles unless that was the only choice afforded to them to save that child's life. If we invest in those opportunities at home, we will not meet them at our border with walls or open arms or asylum laws. This is our opportunity right now to reprioritize the Western Hemisphere, to bring the other countries of the Americas together to help solve some of these challenges before they show up at the U.S.-Mexico border. Thank you for the question. Appreciate it.
Teacher here in Des Moines.
What do you teach?
Journalism, newspaper here, but college speech, English,
Right
so
on.
lots of things. And our state continually underfunds our education. For example, this year, my district, which is Des Moines, has to cut $24 million, and they have to do that for the next 3 years, which means teachers are losing jobs, and teachers are having to move, our class sizes are getting bigger. What are you going to do to help address our public school funding?
Good. Thanks for the question. And please tell those journalists whom you help educate, they are not the enemy of the people. They're the best defense against tyranny, and we're counting on them for this democracy to work. I was in Storm Lake yesterday, and I believe they're voting on a bond issue right now to invest in their schools in the face of a lack of investment from the state of Iowa. Despite the best efforts of Representative Meyer and others who are working on it, but they're working against a majority that just does not believe in it for whatever reason. And so the local property taxpayer is picking up the bill, and this woman stopped me at the town hall in Storm Lake and she said, you know what, I'm going to vote for this bond proposition, but I tell you what, it's probably going to tax me out of my home. I'm just not going to be able to afford to stay here. Something very similar is going on in Texas, where the state has taken on a lesser and lesser share of the cost of public education, pushing more of the responsibility and tax burden to the local property tax district. And we are getting taxed out of our homes in Texas. And so if the state governments are not willing to do their job, and if the local property taxpayer can no longer sustain the burden, I do think there is a role for the federal government to play a greater part, to ensure that every teacher, yourself included, every educator, every cafeteria worker, every school bus driver, every counselor, every librarian is paid a living wage so that they can focus on that job and so that we can recruit the next generation of teachers. I've met teachers my age who say that their sons, their daughters, who want to be educators as well, they're dissuading them from entering the profession because of the high stakes, high pressure tests, the low pay, the fact that a gunman might enter your classroom because we have not formed the political will to have universal background checks and to stop selling weapons of war into our communities, and they don't want their kids to go through the same thing. If we cannot figure this out, we're going to lose an entire generation of teachers and the generation of students that they would have educated. So I think greater federal investment, perhaps contingent upon the states being willing to do their part, finally, in the case of Iowa, in the case of Texas, perhaps in some other states, making sure that education begins not universally at 5 years old in kindergarten, but 4 years old in pre-kindergarten, making sure that we have debt-free higher education, and those graduates who are career ready as well, ready to enter an apprenticeship or join a union or deliver their best at 18 or 19 years old to pay for themselves and their family to have a better future. These are investments that we've got to make. They don't come cheap, but they will produce a return far and above the initial cost of making them. And I, for one, want to make sure that our country leads on public education. Thank you for the question. Thank you for what you're doing.
Hello, my name is Carrie, and I am from Lincoln, Nebraska. Thank you so much for coming here today. I am a nurse practitioner, and I practice in primary care, which is the front lines of healthcare, as most of us know. We are seeing a huge shortage in the next 10 years as primary care physicians retire, and that will put us short in the United States about 90,000 primary care providers. So as nurse practitioners and PAs, we have been put in a position to help with that. One of the biggest problems we have is, yes, the narcotic epidemic and the deaths from narcotics, but also obesity. So after obesity, we know comes this wave of hypertension and diabetes. What's really, really sad is that, for instance, for Medicare patients, I can write for an unlimited amount of narcotics, Percocet, oxycodone, hydrocodone, but I can't write for diabetic shoes. And I can't write for certain nursing home orders and things like that. As the hopeful and future president of the United States, how can you see a better solution to that, and by working with us as PAs and physician assistants and nurse practitioners to just help bulk up the primary care setting and make it more equal and easy for people to get to?
Wow, thank you for the question, and thank you for your public service. A couple of thoughts come to mind. You began with the shortage in providers that we're seeing across America. In the VA alone, where we take care of those who serve this country, we're between 45 to 49,000 clinical positions short. Congress has authorized them. The funds are in the bank. We can't find the people to work the jobs. There are rural communities and smaller towns that can't attract the talent that they need to be able to care for people, and then it compounds the problem. The clinic shuts down, the hospital closes, people don't want to move to that town to teach school or to farm or do whatever they were going to do, and they go somewhere else, and that town runs the risk of drying up and going away. I was in a small Texas town during the Senate race in Fort Stockton, and a woman stood up and she asked me about Obamacare. In fact, she didn't ask me, she told me what she thought of Obamacare, and it was not pleasant. She did not like President Obama, she did not like me because I was a Democrat. And I started to talk about Medicaid expansion in the state and how this was a way that, and she mentioned a very real problem. She works so hard, but earns too much to qualify for Medicaid, but does not earn enough to afford private insurance. And she's out, and she's angry, and she has every right to be. But I started to talk about expanding Medicaid, and she said, you know what, Beto, just stop it right there. There are no doctors in this town to take Medicaid or to take Medicare. And so even if I were eligible, there's nobody that I could see. And then as she says that, somebody else stands up at this Dickey's barbecue in Fort Stockton, which, by the way, was owned by a vegetarian. This guy stands up and he says, actually, I'm a doctor. And I moved back to Fort Stockton, and I was born here, and I went to the high school, and the reason that I'm able to afford to do this is because the taxpayers of Fort Stockton kicked in, as did the state of Texas, believe it or not, and paid for my medical school education contingent upon my commitment to come back to Fort Stockton and care for those who had nurtured my success in the first place. And I think the deal was that he had to come back for 6 years, and then they'd cut him free. He was in his 8th year back home, married his high school sweetheart, was raising the next generation in Fort Stockton. So here's my proposal. What if we expanded the public service loan forgiveness program? If you want to work as a PA or a doctor or a provider in a community that does not have enough of them to take care of the people who live there, then let's wipe clean the debt that you've taken on or prevent you from accruing it in the first place. And then this issue of what we put into our bodies. in our healthcare and who we are. So often we're talking about care in the hospital or at the pharmacist, and that's really important, or at the therapist. But there was someone at the previous house party who came up to me and she said, there's a USDA program that ensures that we take what we grow in these farms and provide it directly to our schools, so there is fresh, local food for our kids to eat, healthy calories going into their system. They're going to be healthier as a result, and our medical costs are going to be lower for them over the course of their lifetime if they learn to eat healthy at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. But there is 4 times the demand for that program than there is supply in current funding in that USDA program today. So from that meeting, and much from your question right now, came a great idea for leadership going forward. Expand that program. Ensure that when we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about food, what we have access to. There are so many parts of this country that are literal food deserts, where you can go to a liquor store, you can go to a check cashing place, you can get some fast food, but you cannot get a healthy meal with fruits and vegetables. You cannot walk to a grocery store to be able to put something healthy into your kids' system so they can burn those calories in a classroom the next day. So I want to make sure that we invest in healthcare providers, especially in underserved communities. I also want to make sure that we invest in healthy living and a healthy diet for our kids and for our adults too, for that matter. Thank you for the question and for what you're doing. Really appreciate it.
In the kitchen, and we have time for 2 more.
Hi, thank you for coming and answering our questions. This is kind of a follow-up to the education question earlier. We know that talent is evenly distributed, but opportunity is not. And I kind of want to know your thoughts or your platform on public education versus vouchers versus charter schools. Can you tell us where you stand on that?
Yeah. So the best way to describe where I stand is to tell you where my kids sit in class every day, which is at Mesita Elementary, a world-class public school. The same one that I went to, only better than when I attended there because they're in dual language programs that didn't exist when I was at Mesita Elementary. So on Monday, they'll be taking math in Spanish. On Tuesday, they'll be taking math in English. They're reading and writing, speaking and listening, but also computing and just existing in both languages and in both worlds. And that innovation of a world-class dual language education came from public school educators. It was an innovation born out of El Paso by listening to those who have those children in front of them. Right now, we know, and this came up in the question earlier from the high school journalism teacher, that too many of our public school systems are really on the brink of collapse. They've seen diminished funding from the state government. The local property taxpayer is taxed out, and there's little more that we can do without some kind of more aggressive federal intervention. And I want to make sure that we make that. I want to make sure that we also expand what we mean when we say public education to begin at pre-K. I do not want your tax dollars or mine or anyone else's to be converted into a voucher that allows someone to use that in a private school, which means money taken away from a public school classroom. And this is a sentiment shared not just by Democrats, but I know from listening to a very angry Republican school teacher who warned me if I allowed Betsy DeVos to turn her tax dollars into vouchers and take them out of her public school classroom, that she would hunt me down, and she would find me, and she would get me. You also asked about charters. I do think there is a role for charters as first envisioned to be a laboratory whose successes can be applied around the larger public school system. But I also think there is no way to charter our way out of some of the challenges that we face right now. I think on a limited basis and public charters only, there's a role for them to play. But the real investment, the real progress, the real opportunity lies in those public schools, and that's why our children are in those public schools right now. Thank you for the question. Appreciate it.
To your right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi.
Hey there.
What are your thoughts on whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, and do you think that people like him should have some form of legal protection?
Really good question, really tough question. Whether it was Edward Snowden, whether it was the release of the Pentagon Papers, very often we only learn what our government is doing in our name when people have the courage to step forward at some personal risk and sacrifice to themselves, whether that's a prison sentence or the condemnation of their fellow citizens. So I want there to be protections and some incentive when what this country is doing does not match what this country is telling us that they are doing. And without getting into specific cases like the one that you raised, I think that principle is incredibly important, especially at a moment that we have an administration that is at war with the press, with the truth, with science and the facts. I want to make sure that they can rise to the surface from wherever they come. I served 6 years on the House Veterans Affairs Committee. And I remember that when veterans in El Paso were telling me that they could not get into the VA was telling me there's absolutely no problem. Every single veteran gets in within 2 weeks, full stop. It was whistleblowers from within the VA who had the courage to come forward to tell me that supported and confirmed the stories I was hearing from veterans that helped me to understand that we had a real crisis on our hands. And if it were not for their courage, I don't know that we would have been able to resolve that and take El Paso from being the worst performing VA for mental health care wait times in the country to some days improving upon the national average. So I want to make sure that whistleblowers are protected, that they are rewarded when they do a public good, and whether that is national security or taking care of our veterans or telling us how our tax dollars are spent, there's a public interest in them being able to do that. Thank you for the question.
We're gonna have, this is our last one right
Okay.
here.
Hello, Beto. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty chill. So I'm a black man, and I live in America. And what I'm noticing is that criminal justice from the federal to the state to the local level seems to be just skewed and awkward in its many ways. So what I'm curious about is, from the federal level, how do you deal with issues that affect people of color in ways of like nonviolent offenders, like you mentioned earlier, who are serving sentences that are quite honestly unfair, legalization of marijuana and providing platforms for these people to be reacclimated to the community, and I guess in even a more general sense than that, how do you repair from the federal level the relationship between black people and like the police and I guess those who are involved in criminal justice on that end?
Thanks for raising these questions, and you asked a number of specific ones. I'm going to do my best to give you, they're really good, specific answers. You mentioned marijuana. I want to end the federal prohibition of marijuana. I want to expunge the arrest records of those arrested for possession of marijuana because they're disproportionately black. And after release from prison, they are forced to check a box in every employment application form saying that they have a conviction. And it makes it less likely, of course, that they're going to get the job. They are no longer eligible for student loans, so it makes it less likely that they're going to be able to attend college and improve their prospects and better themselves and contribute more to the rest of us. I also want to end for-profit prisons in this country because there should not be a profit incentive to keep people incarcerated. Our mandatory minimums, what is considered Schedule 1, so much of that is the lobbyists who are paid by these for-profit prison corporations coming into the offices of members of Congress to extend to the detention bed mandate for immigrants in this country. We have for-profit immigration detention in this country as well. This is an incredible, extraordinary power that the state enjoys over our lives, and it should be restricted to the state and not to private enterprise. And then the war on drugs, as well-intentioned and as heroically fought by some, including in law enforcement, as it might have been, has produced the worst results possible. Marijuana today is just as available as it was in the first year of the Nixon administration, or whenever the war on drugs was officially declared. Only now it is far more potent than it was then. Only now it is being sold in middle schools because drug dealers do not ID. And as the father of a 12-year-old, I'm really concerned about that. In that same period of time, use of tobacco and deaths from tobacco have dropped precipitously, not because we outlawed it or put it on the black market, because we treated it as a public health issue. When it comes to opioid use, abuse, addiction, and overdose, Let's not criminalize people who have a problem. Let's instead treat it as a public health issue. The vast majority of those who are addicted to opioids today began that process with a legally prescribed prescription. And I've met veterans who come to me in meetings like these and said, I'm buying heroin off the street today after being prescribed an opioid at the VA, to which I became addicted. The VA cut me off with nothing to replace it with. And by the way, the VA today cannot prescribe medicinal cannabis, to which you will not become addicted, which will not kill you, and might alleviate your symptoms so that you can get back on your feet and on with your life. That's one of the positive results that we would have by ending marijuana prohibition in this country. And then you ask about our criminal justice system, and specifically police and sheriff's deputies and those who have the power to use force in our lives and against our lives and take our lives as they are sworn to serve and protect our lives. And as we know, too many unarmed black men have been killed by police in this country. And as we know, there is not enough accountability or transparency in how use of force is documented and against whom force is used in this country. Now, the vast majority of every law enforcement officer does a terrific job, a very dangerous job, which we are grateful for. They keep us safe, they keep our communities safe. But in those rare cases, when those entrusted with power abuse it, then the full weight of our criminal justice system should be used against them to make sure that we have justice, to make sure that we can rely on those to protect us, and we do not fear them, as so many people in this country do fear law enforcement today. But lastly, we should understand that the police, the sheriff's deputies, law enforcement are only a part of our criminal justice system, a criminal justice system that is inherently, systematically, and fundamentally racist. Hard for us sometimes to talk about this or to accept it, but from the end of slavery and certainly post-Reconstruction, some communities of color have been criminalized based on the color of their skin. Some people pressed into convict gangs just because employers needed the labor, and that's the truth. Those are the facts, and that is part of our story. Some people suppressed from participating in their government. Some people stopped and frisked because they're wearing baggy clothes and because they are black. That is the truth. Those are the facts. That is part of our story. And so until we change the fundamental root of this problem, the legacy of slavery and segregation and Jim Crow and suppression alive and well in America today, and we are never going to get this right. We're never going to begin the work of repair, which is the word that you used. We will never stop visiting these injustices upon our fellow Americans. It's a tall order. It's a big task. It's going to take all of us working together in order to accomplish it, but it is absolutely necessary if we're going to receive change. Thank you for the question. Okay. Thank you all for being here, for your questions, for welcoming us. Andrea and Nathan and your family, thank you as well. We are going to head outside into the cool breeze. If anyone would like to join us, we'd love to be able to say hello to you or take a picture if you are so inclined. Thank you all very much. Gracias.